So today we're going to look at an article by a guy called James Ball, and he's looking at what could happen to zero-hour contracts post-Brexit. So, as I've said, it's not going to be good, so get ready. So, we tend to treat insecure work as if it's an inevitability. As if a desperate reality of the modern world, immutable and inescapable. For many of us, millions of us, it certainly feels that way. But the reality is quite different. Extensive research conducted for the Trade Unions Conference shows that insecure work is the result of deliberate choices made by employers and lawmakers alike, and something that has risen far faster in the UK than any other European countries. From the junior academic on the treadmill of short-term posts to warehouse workers on zero-hour contracts, millions of the UK workers lack the rights and job security that we have taken for granted for decades. The loss of these rights is disproportionately affects women and people from ethnic minorities and people from regions outside of London because it compounds and exacerbates the inequalities that already abound in the workplace. With Brexit on the horizon, we need to discuss these inequalities as a matter of urgency, because if they don't, the situation stands to get worse, and a lot worse. So, insecure work, what is it and who does it? So, the TUC, a federation of most of the UK's major trade unions, which represent about 5.6 million workers, says that there are around 3.2 million people living in insecure work across the UK. That's made up of around 800,000 people on the infamous zero-hour contracts. These offer no guaranteed hours, which can leave people with 40 or 50 hours of work one week and then nothing the next. These people are joined by around over 700,000 people who are agency or seasonal workers, and other workers with similar contracts which do not guarantee hours or a term of employment. There's a further around 1.7 million quasi self-employed workers on low pay who often end up working in effect for larger companies or the government, but who receive less than the national living wage. These totals These totals are skyrocketing. The number of people in insecure work has jumped 27% since 2011, with zero-hour contracts in particular showing the most dramatic increases. In 2006, there were just 70,000 people on zero-hour contracts versus the more than 800,000 today. While the total number of self-employed people increased by 1 million people in the wake of the financial crisis, the particular challenge of insecure work is that it tends to affect people who already face difficulty getting good jobs, fair pay and good conditions. Women are seemingly more likely than men to be in insecure jobs, with 11% of women doing such roles versus 9% of men. Workers from ethnic minorities are even more likely to be insecure overall. BME people are around a third more likely to be in insecure jobs rather than their white counterparts. But when you focus explicitly on black workers, the disparity grows even further. 1 in 8 black workers are in insecure roles versus just the 1 in 20 white workers. Finally, the geography disparity and the rise of insecure jobs is stark. In London, the UK's richest region by far, is just 17% of the job growth since 2011, which is insecure roles. But in the northeast of England, by some measures of the country's poorest region, insecure jobs make up 67% of all new roles. So this is one thing that the government has been not ignoring since the coalition. But you tell people this, and that this isn't something us leaving Europe will solve. And even if we were in the European Union, this isn't their problem to solve, it's the government's problem to solve, and their policies which they can put in place, but they choose not to. So, the industries which make most up of the rise of these casual jobs are hospitality and retail, residential care homes, and education work. The workers interviewed by the TUC said that the casual work made their lives difficult to manage, especially if they had if their loved ones fall ill. I've often been cancelled at the last minute for work, a teacher in her late 20s has told the researchers. I have not even been told I was cancelled until I turned up for work, which makes meeting ends meet and saving up very difficult, as I don't know how much wage I will have until the end of each week. A care worker in her early 20s said she felt pressured to take on extra shifts at very short notice, less than an hour sometimes. Worried that if I don't take them, I won't get offered extra work in the future, which means I won't be getting enough work to pay bills. Outside of the public sector, there is the rise of Amazon and other online retailers, especially in fast fashion, has led to the proliferation of courier companies, many who insist their couriers are not staff, 0 hour or otherwise, but instead are independent, self-employed contractors, meaning they lose many entitlements and protections, such as sick pay. I have phoned in sick, and I am threatened with a penalty of £50 from the contractor I work under a self-employment contract. If I didn't bring a carrier bag or a bucket to deal with bad guts I was suffering with, one contractor told the TUC. The rise of insecure work, especially self-employed contractors, has impacts on the tax base, as employers are required to pay national insurance for people on secure contracts, but they do not need to pay these contributions for non-employees. The estimates of the cost to the taxpayer have risen to around 3.4 billion, from 3.4 billion to 5.9 billion a week. That's 113 million a week if you're looking for a figure to put on the side of a bus. So how does the UK stack up internationally? So there's been a lot of conversation around how work is changing, and acts as if insecure work is something that we will necessarily increase as we see more automation and the rise of effective AIs to displace office jobs. That is true to an extent, but comparing the UK to other EU nations reveals that actually it is possible to create more secure jobs and fewer insecure jobs. It's just a matter of priorities. The National Institute for Economic and Social Research looked at insecure jobs across 28 nations of the EU and found that between 2008 and 2015, the UK had the third highest rate of increase of temporary workers, but the largest increase, and by a large margin, of self-employed workers over that time. And self-employment actually fell in 13 of the 28 countries over that period. This wasn't because the UK was creating new jobs over that time and other countries weren't. Germany had the strongest employment growth of any other country over that period of study, but the rates of temporary work and self-employed workers actually fell over that time. The UK also hasn't seen any dramatic changes to workers' rights over that period. By and large, the employment rights have not changed much under the coalition or subsequent Conservative government, though access to justice through tribunals has become harder. The reason for the rise, the organisation proposes, was that the UK laws had already been tilted in favour of employees, in favour of employers and light regulation. but did give dramatically different levels of protection to workers in different classes of employment, giving employers incentive to change their structures during the financial crisis. This was enabled by the rise of the app economy. The UK, they argued, is already an exceptional case when it comes to non-traditional work, saying that the UK government's lack of action to change its employment rules becomes practice in a policy becomes a policy position. The absence of new legislation in the context of other changes can be regarded as a policy decision in itself, as it is seen as an endorsement of the already existing deregulation and the liberal labour market. Or in other words, the apparent inaction of the labour market is in fact a positive endorsement for the status quo. A thumbs up to companies who seek to evade their responsibilities as employers by coasting on zero-hour contracts and denying sick pay to couriers, teachers or care workers. Other European countries have introduced explicit protection to tackle aspects of insecure work. France only allows fixed-term employment for up to 18 months, though faces higher youth unemployment, while Germany only allows agency workers to be used for 18 months. Elsewhere in the Netherlands has placed restrictions on zero-hour contracts, regulating for a maximum number of paid hours each shift, and the requiring hours to be made of a regular if certain number of hours are worked in a given time period. Other countries give employers much more direct responsibility for their contractors. Even if self-employment requires them to check up on the people working in such a way that it equivalates the equivalent rates to what the maximum minimum wage would be for employed workers. The UK could easily introduce any of those schemes, or even reduce the incentive for employers to shift people out of employment to insecure work by changing who is entitled to employment rights and who incurs the national insurance payments. Now, I'm sure you're all asking this question: where does Brexit come into this? So, Brexit is already so complicated and so badly handled that it might seem odd to start dragging employment rights into the process, until we remember that the EU was instrumental in securing many of our protections for workers that do not exist in the UK, and the European courts have helped enforce such protections, sometimes over government protests. It was the EU that forced the government in 1993 to extend maternity leave to all working women. It was the EU that has closed the loopholes in the UK law that left pregnant British women vulnerable to firing as recently as 1994. It was the EU that forced the UK to legislate for equal pay for work of equal value, and that most recently has introduced the equal pay and pensions for part-time workers, 75% of those who are women. Finally, it was specifically EU law that prevented the coalition government from introducing a compensation cap that would have made it cheaper for companies to discriminate against women and pay a fine rather than pay them fairly. In theory, the UK government has promised to transfer all these protections into UK law by the time the UK leaves the EU, without watering down or removing any of the existing protections, though several conservative backbenchers have called exactly for this. Workers, their unions and MPs will need to watch how these rights are transposed into UK law or how they are enforced, but this will open a new window of opportunity, given that workers' rights and protections will have been put in front of Parliament. Why not take the opportunity to reform and extend these protections? Will the right political will and measures be taken to tackle insecure work? And a government commissioned review led by Matthew Taylor has set out a range of options that could already be tackled. The government, with its non-existent majority, would struggle to resist reasonable amendments, especially those based on a report it commissioned itself. Such amendments would not serve to fix the troubles of insecure work, but would also require childcare reform and fixes to cost of housing, but could start the UK on down a different track. Brexit will damage the UK economy and pose a real risk to UK jobs and pay, but in its small way it could also present an opportunity opportunity for change for millions of people if politicians are brave enough to seize it. In line with gender equality principles, James Ball has taken a 18.4% pay cut this week. So there you have it, essentially. And as I've been warning a lot of people, just because they say, oh, we'll put these into UK law, you've got to watch how they're going to put into UK law. Would they take an existing EU law that protects workers' rights, and instead of just saying and copying and paste it like they say, like they claim they will, would they instead change it so that it doesn't protect as workers as it used to? Or would they even water it down? These are the things you've got to watch out for, because people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are calling for this, and yet people support this idiot as if he is some sort of saviour and meant to be future Prime Minister. And yet, as I've said, people support him. He is not a hero of the working class that often people make him out to be. But there you go, that's Brexit for you.